Are you strategic? The answer is the difference between failure and a Kevlar competitive advantage. Welcome to Strategic Minds, the podcast that explores how elite achievers use a strategic approach to excel in their fields. I'm your host, Rich Horwath, author of Strategic, and my vision is to teach the world to be strategic, working as a strategy facilitator, advisor, and coach to executive teams. I'll be your guide as we do a deep dive into conversations with extraordinary leaders to learn new ways to think, plan, and act strategically. You'll discover game-changing insights to turbocharge your performance and become a true difference maker. Now, let's explore Strategic Minds.
We're stuck. What do we do? I have no idea.
You need a new strategy.
We need a more dynamic strategy.
The strategy?
You have to strategize.
But you won't strategize.
Let's talk a little strategy.
Today on the show, I'm excited to speak with Bill Harris. For 30 years, Bill has been a prolific thought leader and company catalyst at the intersection of investing, tax, and technology. He ran TurboTax, was CEO of PayPal, and founded Personal Capital, which grew to a $23 billion investment firm. He founded Evergreen Money in early 2023 and has started a number of other financial technology and cybersecurity companies. Bill is also the author of the brilliant and extraordinarily valuable book, Investment Tax Guide, How to Slash Your Taxes, which has been described as the Bible of investment tax strategy. Bill, thank you for being on the show.
My pleasure. Great to be here.
So if we could, let's begin with your origin story. If you wouldn't mind, please share with us where you grew up and how that environment and the people there shaped who you are today.
Well, I started out as a child and born in Boston to sort of upper middle class family. My dad was a doctor, and I think my parents, as with most people, my parents were, and particularly my father, was the biggest influence in my life through not only when I was young, but even today. He's 96 years old today and going strong.
Wonderful, wonderful. And so I would be interested if you think about some of the more formative experiences early in your career, from a leadership, from a strategy perspective, are there one or two things that stand out as you look back today and say, those were a couple or one or two instances where those were inflection points, those really started to form who I would become later down the road?
The first important part was, a good part of the early part of my life was I was doing things to please my parents, and I was pretty good at most things, and so was able to do that. And then gradually started to take on the desire to please what I thought society wanted of me. So that's good schools, do well, good jobs at good companies, do well. And so it was, the first thing was the transition from being focused on doing what I had been brought up to do, to being focused what I thought my role was to do as an adult. That lasted until I was about 40 years old. And so I went to business school, and I worked in leading organizations, and ultimately ended up being CEO of Intuit, which was a public company with 5,000 employees. At that point, I realized that I was not good at that I was not fundamentally a manager. I'm fundamentally an idea person, hopefully a strategist, but not a manager. I'm not administrative. But I had been trying to do that for 20 years. And part of it was because of how I was raised, and part of it was that I went to business school, and I thought that's what I had been trained to do, and that was what success was. And in fact, I didn't like it, and I was really not good at it. And so one of the things I did, what my job was, human resources and capital allocation, as well as some investor relations. But what I really wanted to do was be effectively the product manager the product strategist for the company. And we had 13 divisions, 13 products, and so I would swoop in and try to be involved. And really what I just did is got in the way of people who were trying to do their job. And so it became clear that I should find something where I could really do what I'm good at and not pretend that I can do things that I'm not good at. At that point, I left Intuit and joined Elon Musk and Peter Thiel, and we started PayPal. And that was, a handful of people over top a bakery on University Street in Palo Alto. And from that small beginnings, we had a great time forming a new company, a new strategy, but it was a very different experience than what I had done in a larger corporate setting. And I found that it was something that I enjoyed more, but more importantly, I was good at. And so, since that time, I've started, I think, 8 or 9 different financial technology companies. I've had a blast doing them. Almost all of them have been successful. And really what was important in order to change my life that way was to admit to myself that there were things that I was not good at, and some of those things that I was not good at were central to my understanding of myself.
And that central understanding to yourself, Bill, as you explored those pathways, did the idea of identifying your purpose come into your mind? Was it formalized as purpose, or was there other things that you were thinking about when you were trying to find that pathway of not what should Bill be doing, but what am I really good at and what do I enjoy? So did purpose come into play there, or was it more just finding opportunities to see what resonated?
Well, yes, and the two most important words in my life are purpose and curiosity. And it's a flare and focus function. The curiosity, when you're starting from scratch, particularly if you have the luxury of doing things that I do, which is start a company, build it, ultimately it goes into someone else's hands very frequently, and so now you're doing it again. There's the initial period where you can just be curious. You can be curious about every aspect of the industry. You can be curious about every aspect of the world, and it's fascinating. My gosh, whether it's neurobiology or ancient history, anthropology, whatever it is, just a fascinating world. And that scatters you all over the place. And then gradually, the cycle of my life, I start to pick things up. I start to then get a little more focused. I start to think about, all right, well, here's something that I actually would want to do as opposed to just understand. And then gradually hone that into something that becomes an idea, that becomes a company, and then now I'm back into a focused purpose until we get to the next milestone. And at some points then, all right, it's opportunity once again to be curious and think about the next one.
Excellent. In that curiosity phase, are there certain questions that you found helpful in starting to hone in on what might be the next big idea for you? Are there questions, are there any methodologies that you work through as you're thinking strategically through options?
Yes, and it's quite simple. If you're going to start a business and it's brand new, it better be new, different, and better. And it's easy to say that, of course, but why? If you're going to start a business, look for the opportunity to do something from scratch. That's where, particularly in the tech business, you have an advantage. I was, for instance, when we were raising money for personal capital, I was in a venture capital meeting, explained to them what the business was. They said, okay, so who do you compete with? And I said, well, Schwab, Fidelity, Vanguard, Goldman, and Morgan. And they looked at me and they said, do you know how many clients they have, how many employees they have, how many assets they have, how much they spend every year on IT, which is multiple billions of dollars each year for each of those companies? How in the world do you expect to compete? And I said, exactly. That is my competitive advantage. I have nothing. And having nothing in a period of rapidly accelerating change is an incredible strategic advantage if you know what to do with it. So new, that's the starting point. The next step is, okay, that's the base. What are you going to do with it? It darn well better be different. If it's not different, don't even try, because you will fail. You have every single disadvantage versus everyone who's out there in terms of money and customers and reputation and economies of scale and every disadvantage, except that you are not bound by the way you have done things in the past. And it's not only technology. I mean, in the Silicon Valley, we always talk about legacy technology, but it's much more than that. It's legacy people, legacy process, legacy paradigm. It's legacy customers. I mean, God made the world in 7 days, but he didn't have an installed base. And so you have to do things differently in order, because that is the only thing that you have where you are not at a disadvantage. And then finally, the toughest part is you have to do things better. That not only has to be different, but also has to be better. And that's where the real challenge comes. So what am I looking for? I'm looking for a way in. I've operated for the most part in the financial technology arena. I'm familiar with a number of the problem sets, and I'm looking to be inspired by a way in. Oh, here's a problem that could be done differently and could be significantly better. And when I say way in, one of the important things is to think about where innovation comes from. And I think it rarely comes from someone who has been doing the same work for 20 years. And they may be very skilled and well-meaning and hardworking and smart. But if you've been doing the same thing in the same industry for 20 years, you typically have blinders on. You know too much. You know how things work, and you're really good at how it works this way. And if somebody comes with a new idea, you might say, well, yeah, Johnny tried that 4 years ago. It didn't work. So that's number one. Number two, if you are completely uninvolved, if you're so distant from the problem that you're not even aware of what the issues are, you're unlikely to be involved either. So where does it come from? It comes from being adjacent, close enough that you can see into the dynamics of a business, what the objectives are, how it's being done today, and then be able to think about it differently, unconstrained from long and deep experience doing that particular thing. With regard to that, I have been blessed over the past 30 years when I've been starting companies. I have been blessed by being pretty deep in financial technology, but always being able to find the next vertical or the next use case where I had not done it before. I could see enough into the process to understand what might be done and how it could be improved. And then with inspiration, you then start to focus on it and hone the idea. And if it really has legs, then ultimately give it a try.
Excellent. Love that process. And I think for everyone listening out there, the idea of new, different, and better is something that can absolutely be applied. I would be interested, Bill, from your perspective. We'll have a lot of leaders out there that have been in their fields for 20 years. And so one of the questions they'll have is, Bill, is there a way for us to still innovate even though we have been in the weeds of the business for 20 years or so? Any advice that you'd have for folks that have been in a field for 20 years or so where it is going to be more challenging to innovate?
Yes and no. In other words, yes, I've got some thoughts. And no, I've never been able to pull it off myself. Okay. But it feels like if you are in a larger organization and you are looking to establish change agents within that organization, being able to build skunk works, give people, put together a group of people that are focused on this and nothing else, and then give them protection from the rest of the organization, and then maintain that through the ups and downs of the budget cycle, because every time the budgets are tight, who gets cut? It's the people who aren't generating profits today. But to the extent that you can create an organization within an organization that really can focus in on itself and separate itself from the ongoing operations of the rest of the business for, let's call it, 2 years. And at that point, then, to the extent that you've developed traction, at that point, then be ready to rip that apart and reintegrate it within the mothership. Mm-hmm. That, to me, is a pattern that I have seen work. I still think it's difficult. It is fundamentally difficult to make significant change within a large established organization. And I will mention this. When you think about who can be successful making, now I'm not just talking about a new product or something like that, but a true refocusing of a corporation. It is, ironically, the companies that are doing poorly that can do that. If you're doing really well and you're on top of your game, it is punishing from an economic point of view and also not intuitive from a psychological point of view to then say, okay, this is not good, I have to find something else. On the other hand, if you're in trouble, then I think it's the Chinese who say, never waste a good crisis. Maybe Winston Churchill said that, who knows? But if you're in trouble, then you have the opportunity to really change the basic foundation and DNA of a corporation. And the couple of examples I'd say in terms of a large organization where that happened, number one, of course, was Apple. And so Steve Jobs came back, fired everybody, put everything on an entirely new track. But two things. First of all, yes, he was Steve Jobs. But secondly, Apple at that point was in dire straits. They were 6 months away from bankruptcy. He could not have done that, even as Steve Jobs, if the situation had not been so difficult. Number two, Andy Grove at Intel. And at Intel, they had a great business doing flash memory, and then the Japanese came in and cut the prices in half, and that company was, once again, threatened in terms of its very existence. And what Andy Grove said is, okay, we're going to take the x86 architecture, which became the power for the chip that powered personal computers for decades, and continues to. And it was student body left, okay, we're going this direction. An incredible gamble that in anything but desperate straits would have been resisted from employees to customers to board members.
So to build on those examples, when we see a business model described, oftentimes it's described in simple terms as how one creates value, delivers value, and captures value. So as you think about those examples and others, do you feel that a senior leadership team that's been in an industry for a while can still evolve their business model in the way that they create, deliver, and capture value enough to ride a new wave of innovation? Or do you feel, back to your earlier comments, that in certain respects, if you don't create that skunk works, it's really not going to happen in your shop? So how would you advise leaders to think about evolving their business model?
It's a really good point. And I think in some industries you can. In some industries it's a lot harder. And so what are the examples of people who have continuously evolved? Most of the large tech companies, even Microsoft, which stumbled, has come back and when I say stumbled, I'm talking about a decade or two ago. I was one of the 13 witnesses against Microsoft in the antitrust trial in 1997, where we actually got a judgment to break up Microsoft, to break it in two pieces. That was subsequently it was reversed. So they were riding very high in the 1990s and early 2000s, and then suffered greatly, and now they're back. All of the other ones, obviously Meta and Apple and Amazon, they have been tremendously capable of adding new businesses, revving their own businesses, etc. But there are other businesses where the cycle times of innovation are becoming so fast that if you build a business based on a set of technology and the economics that go along with that technology, you still haven't hit the top of the value that you're delivering using one paradigm of technology and service, when the next wave is coming up right underneath you. And in that instance, it's very often the right choice from a shareholder point of view to say, I'm very good at what I'm doing. I know that it will last for a while and then it will decay. And I know that somebody else is coming up with a new technology or a new approach or whatever and will ultimately supersede me. But from an economic point of view, I should manage this cash flow, manage this business, and then manage the cash flow to the happiest result. Example of that, I was on the board of Earthlink, which was the second largest ISP in the world behind America Online. And broadband came along. We were telephone dial-up, and broadband came along, and now all of a sudden we were competing with cable companies and telephone companies and things like that. We tried to compete. We did all sorts of things. We went into local Wi-Fi. We tried to do virtual mobile phone operations. We tried many things in order to move forward with the next technology and the next set of economics. And we failed at everything. We didn't have not only the people, but we didn't have the skills, resources, and high ground. We lost hundreds of millions of dollars on these efforts to build within the organization a next generation. What we should have done, and we ultimately did, was say, okay, we understand what business we're in. We're in the telephone dial-up business. The telephone dial-up business is going to go away. But in the meantime, it's a heck of a business. We were generating, I think, $1.5 billion in cash flow on an annual basis. And you know what? The business is not going to go away immediately. And in fact, it really was a slow taper. And so what was the right decision there? Ride the cash flow. Maximize the cash flow, satisfy the customers during the period of time when that's the service they wanted, and then retire the business.
Love the way that you laid that out. We read oftentimes these days that, because things are happening so quickly and technology's changing so fast that in some people's minds, strategy is becoming obsolete. But I'd be interested from your perspective, as someone who started a number of different companies, how do you think about strategy development early on in the company's origin? And then does that a way you approach strategy change or evolve as the company becomes more mature?
Yes, and let me give it to you from my particular perspective, which is not going to be the perspective of everyone. When I think about it, given what I'm doing these days, which is starting young companies and going 0 to 1, when I think of strategy, it's really product strategy. We're thinking of putting a product together, and then how do we go to market, and who's our customer base, and what are their needs, and what is our business model. I think for people in a larger organization, It's more than product-based strategy. It's really company strategy, corporate strategy, and that also involves which businesses will we go into, what will we divest, etc. But if you're looking at it simply from what would be my point of view, product strategy, then do two things. Bring together the customer need, and everybody talks about that, understanding what it is that you're delivering that is truly going to scratch an itch. And secondly, the business model. Because there are a lot of great things you can do for customers that you can't make any money at. You can't sustain. And so the business model side of it, for me, as an example, business strategy. I've sold boxed software in the old days. I've sold business to business. I've sold business to consumer. I've sold, transactional things. I've sold subscription businesses. I will never do another business to business because it's too slow. If you're selling to large organizations, like large financial institutions, and that's what I have done, it's a 1.5-year sales cycle, 1.5-year implementation cycle, 1.5-year deployment cycle. Best case. Whereas on the consumer side, you can go much quicker. If you find the means to customer acquisition, you can move much more quickly. So number one, for me, on high-level strategy, I'm going consumer direct. That's all I will do for the rest of my career because it's what has been successful for me. The other thing is recurring revenue. You just have to have, it is so much more favorable to have a recurring revenue stream rather than having to earn the revenue again and again every quarter. And in that regard, right now, I'm back to a business model that I've enjoyed in the past, which is assets under management fees. In other words, we're doing investment management, financial management, and then we take a percentage of the total assets that we're managing. That is our fee. Not only is it a recurring revenue, it's like a subscription business, but it's even better because I don't have to go renew the subscription. It just is perpetually renewing itself simply because I'm managing the assets.
Excellent. And one of the things, Bill, as you think about the go-to-market or product strategies that you've outlined in some of the organizations you've worked with and now with Evergreen Money, one of the things that comes up, and I see a lot of leaders when I facilitate strategy conversations struggle as leadership teams with the idea of making trade-offs, not trying to be all things to all people, not watering down things by spreading resources too thin. Any advice that you'd have for leaders on making trade-offs, either techniques for making them, any principles that you think about as you're making trade-offs on your go-to-market or product strategies?
Yeah. Well, do what I say, not what I do. Because what I will tell you right now is that, again, I'm talking from my own perspective, which is, a startup. You can never focus enough. You can never shave off enough bells and whistles. You can never, identify your customer sharply enough. You can never focus your efforts of yourself and your company enough. Because you're a brand new startup, you cannot do very much. You have to pick up the single most important thing and just get it to the single best segment of people who will appreciate it. And then, let me tell you that that's what I say all day long, and that's what I fail to deliver all day long. Because I'm even more than a strategist, I'm an idea guy. I love ideas. And so I have real difficulty. One of the advantages I have starting businesses is that I've got great enthusiasm for new things. And I have a reasonable ability to sort of pick out, to come up with new formulations and to judge whether they're going to be powerful. But that enthusiasm for new things is hard to harness once you are now into the phase of actually trying to get to market. So, and then there's a second step, The second step is, all right, now you've finally got traction, and it looks like you've got a formula. Okay, we know how we're going to make money. We know who our customers are. We know we're going to deliver. Now, the big strategy, and this is where we leave me behind, the big strategy change at that point is you need to go from people who are idea people, such as myself, to people who are execution people. Because in the early stages, when you're trying to figure out what this thing is, process is your enemy. You need to be able to, turn on a dime, call the investors, say, you know what I told you last week? It was stupid. We're doing something else now, and bob and weave until you find the formula. Once you find the formula, now we need process. Now we need somebody who's going to scale this thing, who's going to make every month be a little bit better, and that's an entirely different skill set than certainly I have. And so when I have been successful in organizations, it has been when I have focused on the early stages, the first 3 to 5 years, and then as we're successful, known enough to take myself out.
So to that point, Bill, one of the things I'd be interested in, I see oftentimes leaders have different approaches when they're working with their board of directors, and obviously you've sat on both sides. What's your thought on the role of directors on a board as it relates to strategy development? Obviously, you talked about the ideation piece, and that's one of your strengths, and then passing that along to people on execution. Typically, along that pathway, you've got a board that you need to work with. In some ways, how have you approached that, or any advice that you'd have for leaders out there on engaging the board on strategy, and what does good look like from your perspective?
I've had the opportunity to be on many boards, both public and private. And so I've experienced that. I've also had many boards to whom I have reported, and so I've had that experience as well. And I'd say there's a big difference between boards of larger organizations, and I don't mean huge, but once you've got a couple hundred people perhaps, and startup boards. On a larger board, what it's really about is governance and doing things right, and also discipline, making sure that the organization is putting in the right control processes and strategic processes, and evolving and growing as an organization should at that stage. The role of a board of a startup is wildly different, because if you come in and start saying, all right, we need governance, we need process, we need controls, and let's do a bunch of 5-year plans, and let's have a capital budgeting review, and all of these things, first of all, you'll drown the organization. But secondly, you'll suffocate the organization, because starting a business like this is an almost physically demanding thing. It's you got to get up in the morning, and yesterday was a disaster. Your customers don't like the ideas, or the development is now 3 months delayed, or you can't hire the people you need, or whatever it is. It's a struggle. It's also rewarding, but it is a struggle. And so the best role of a board member at an early startup is, and I don't say this dismissively, is to be a cheerleader. Say, you know what? Tell me what you're up to. That sounds really interesting. Have you thought about it this way? Go do it. You can do this thing. And then when there's trouble, when you've missed the numbers, when you've missed the milestones, it's not it's not the notion of, well, the board has to hold people accountable. No, the board has to support the exploration and the energy that is required to find one's way as a startup.
And to that point, I see a lot of senior leadership teams very scripted in their presentations to boards versus a more interactive conversation. when you've worked with senior leadership teams, let's say now you're on the board side, you're a director, any things that that you've seen as a pattern or theme when executives are struggling with strategic direction, and you as a board member need to help them, to guide them a bit? I mean, any common mistakes or issues that you see from leaders in trying to develop strategy, things that we might be able to keep an eye out for ourselves as we're moving forward?
Well, as it relates to the relationship between the management and the board, I would say two things. Everybody really needs to know the difference. Management is to manage the company. Boards are to guide the company and provide oversight, but not management. And particularly in very small companies, and particularly when you have skilled and experienced VCs on your board, when you're having board meetings not once a quarter, but once a month, and sometimes the board members start to think that, well, they are management, or at least they're going to make those management calls. And so the first thing it's important to understand for each to understand what their role is. And the second, having been both on boards and reported to boards, I think the biggest failure is when management feels that it has to go to boards with all the questions answered. And I certainly did that. When I would have board meetings, I would spend, and this is not unusual, the better part of a week preparing slides and getting the financials. And by the way, that we don't have good financial systems, so it's always a bunch of manual running around and and although I was thinking to myself, well, yes, I'm pulling together the right information so that we can have an intelligent board meeting and all that, what I was really doing is trying to prove to the board that I knew what I was doing, that everything's, don't worry, board, we are headed in a well focused path. And in fact, not only does that end up meaning that I spend a good part of the week putting together fancy slides that are not really pushing the business forward, but it also means that I don't engage with the board members in terms of trying to think through the problems, because I'm trying to come presenting as if I've thought it all through. Here it is. It's easier for me now because I'm older and I don't quite care as much what people think of me. But even now, I will do what most of us do, which is trying to present ourselves as fully thought through and fully in control.
I love that advice too about coming, with questions and having a mutual problem-solving mentality. I think that's something that we can all certainly take back with us. You talked earlier about the customer piece. I just wanted to go back to that. One of the things, and you talked about being an idea person, and you've obviously come up with a number of great ideas that have grown companies from blank whiteboards to billions of dollars. So I'd be interested, what's your take on the idea of going to customers with a solution as opposed to the idea of let's really dig into our customers to ask them what they want, versus the Steve Jobs you mentioned approach earlier of we should tell the market what's next for them. How have you approached that idea of product development with regards to getting customer insights in that process?
I think it depends. It depends on whether the change is evolutionary or revolutionary. Let me take the example of Intuit. Intuit, which made Quicken, it makes Quicken, QuickBooks, and TurboTax. It's sold off Quicken, but they were a case study, literally a Harvard case study in understanding the customer. And they did usability studies and focus groups and all of that. They invented the notion of a follow me home, which is where you're meeting somebody in the store. They're buying your product. You say, "Could I follow you home and see, how you use it?" you're a QuickBooks user, and then they'd sit for an afternoon with somebody and just watch, what do they need to do. Anyway, a paragon of this notion of really understanding what the customer wants. Did it extremely well. Where did that take us? When I left in the late 90s, we were the best desktop financial software publisher in the world. 10 years later, we were the best desktop financial software publisher in the world. Meaning that during those 10 years, when the rest of the world had moved pretty aggressively into server-based, web-based software, we had not. And one of the reasons we had not was that we would go talk to our customers and we would say, what do you want? And they would say, I want this additional feature or that additional feature. But they wouldn't say, well, I just want to scrap everything here, and I think you should put all of my data up on the cloud someplace. We didn't even have the word cloud, and do it that way. In fact, if we asked them something like that, would you like us to do something where we'll take your data and we'll put it someplace else, and you don't know where it is, and but you trust us? They said, absolutely not. And this is the issue of having an installed base. So these are people who love things the way they are. If they didn't, they wouldn't be your customer in the first place. They know what the incremental or evolutionary pieces are that they would like that can tack on to what they already know and love. But they can't envision, or even if they can envision, they don't really want something revolutionarily new. So it depends. And I think most established organizations and established products probably really need to focus on understanding the customer and then driving the product roadmap from the customer first. If you're starting something brand new and if you're really trying to make it new, different, and better, then yes, the customer is really important, but you have to go to the customer with a fully formed notion. You can't just say, hey customer, what do you want? You have to have the thesis. I spent a little time at the D School in Stanford, D for design school. And what they teach you is to have the idea, form it out, and then prototype it in any way you can, and then get it to customers quickly. I mean, even if it's just a cardboard prototype or whatever it is. And that's really valuable to accelerate this whole process. But you need to go to the customer with a product. Here, what do you think of this?
Great guidelines. And the other part of the equation when we think about customers is competition. And I see a lot of leadership teams trying to walk that fine line between being responsive to what the competition is offering and being too reactive to what they're offering, so that at the end of the day, we're seeing competitive convergence where because the competition's doing X, we're doing X, and now all of a sudden we've lost a lot of, you talked about that importance of differentiation. So as a company evolves, I see companies losing the differentiation because they feel they have to copy or replicate things that the competition's coming up with. What would be your principles, Bill, as you think about and have worked with competition? Any thoughts or ideas that you'd like to share relative to how you've approached competition in the past and walking that fine line between being responsive from a value standpoint and being reactive?
Yes. Let's identify two dimensions. One is whether it's an existing business operating under existing rules or whether you're trying to take on an industry and do things differently. The other is whether the industry is highly concentrated and it's a share battle, or highly fragmented. To the extent that it is a share battle, highly concentrated with existing, where people are selling existing products, boy, it's all about the competition. Because every sales call, every opportunity, every product feature, it's you're directly head to head because you're competing for the same customers with the same deliverable. On the other hand, if it's a highly fragmented market, or if you are a new player doing something different, which just means that you're going to be tiny in relation to everybody else who's out there, no, competition's meaningless. Who cares? Really what you need to do is you need to build your product and your vision as deep and powerful and attractive to the customer as it possibly can be. And, it just doesn't, the competition doesn't matter. You're looking to win the customer, and you're not competing directly with anyone. When I started Personal Capital, which is a digital wealth management firm, we started at about the same time as Wealthfront and Betterment, who are robo-advisors. Now, we thought, and I continue to think, that Personal Capital was not a robo-advisor, was significantly different for a different audience, a different set of features, all that, and it was. Nevertheless, there was a reasonable degree of competitive overlap. And people would come and, ask me, well, do you compete? Do you worry about them? Are you fighting them? All the rest. And I say, do you realize how tiny each one of us is compared to this incredibly huge market of managing people's money? And how incredibly tiny we are even compared to any single one of the established competitors. So, do I compete with them? Yes, in the sense that a fisherman on one side of the Atlantic competes with a fisherman on the other side of the Atlantic. They're both fishing in the same pond. But from a practical point of view, do I worry about them? No. And so, and it's also liberating if you can just focus on building the best thing you can, and focusing on the customers rather than on the competition.
Great, excellent guidelines there. I wanted to finish up the conversation, and for those of you on video, you can see on YouTube the book I'm holding up, The Investment Tax Guide, and I found it an extremely beneficial, very useful, really elegantly written book. And I was wondering, Bill, if you could share with us what the inspiration was for writing the book. I mean, you didn't have to write it. You've accomplished a lot in your life. You've run a lot of different companies. You started different companies. What was your inspiration for the book, and what do you really hope that leaders gain from reading it?
Well, one of the reasons I wrote it was I thought it was going to be easy, and of course it was not. And you've written books, and you know what a Sisyphean task it is. But I'm interested in many things, and I'm interested in, the things we talked about in the book. Why specifically did I do that book now? It relates to the coming together of the current business that I'm starting, Evergreen Money, which is a banking and a digital online banking and investment firm. How did I come up with that idea? I've done investment management. I have a couple of companies, been in and around investment management, portfolio management. And I've also, for 10 years, I ran TurboTax. I'm not a tax attorney, but I'm relatively familiar with how taxes work. And by the way, I think not being a tax attorney is a good thing in this case, because I'm able to think about taxes with a degree of sophistication, but think about it from the point of view of a non-professional. Mm-hmm. It's a 300-page book, but if I had been a tax attorney, it would have been 3,000 pages. Right. But how did I come up with, and what was the genesis of Evergreen, combining financial management with tax management? Because there are very few people in the financial services arena today who do anything but talk about pre-tax results. Mm-hmm. And if you are careful and wise about how you structure your investments, you can significantly decrease the tax bite, which is the same as increasing your return. And so given that that was the foundation for the company that I'm building, merging investment management, financial management, and tax management all together into one seamless platform, then it made a lot of sense to write this book, which was an exposition of the kinds of strategies that we are now automating for our clients within the business.
Excellent. And again, having read the book, learned a lot through the top 10 tax strategies that you share in the book. Things like donor advised funds, wasn't super familiar with that. So again, highly recommend anybody out there who does investing, even small investing, extremely useful, very practical, and Bill has taken a complex subject and made it really easy to read. So really would recommend that, and we'll obviously put the connection to Amazon in the show notes where you can pick that up as well. So Bill, I know we're about at time, so I really wanted to say thank you so much. I think you've shared a lot of great ideas, concepts, and then practical, useful tools for all of us to use as we apply strategy and leadership to what we do based on the wealth of experiences that you've had. So thank you very much for being on the show today.
My pleasure. Great fun. Thanks.
What are we talking about? Practice?
Practice makes perfect. Practice makes
Profit.
A key criterion of strategy is the trade-off. A trade-off is made when you focus on one area and intentionally exclude others. When Mary Barra took over as CEO of General Motors in 2014, she said, "We're here to win. We aren't going to win by being all things to all people everywhere. That's not the right strategy." A method for practicing trade-offs is to use the trade-off matrix. Consider where you and your team allocate your resources, your time, your talent, your people, and your budget. And then evaluate your current tasks, your initiatives, your meetings, all of that stuff, and determine if they should be placed in one of four quadrants. Eliminate, so we're saying we're going to eliminate all of our investment of resources in X or Y activity. So the second quadrant would be decrease. So what areas do we want to decrease our investment of resources? Then the third quadrant would be increase. So where would we like to put more time, more energy, more people, more budget to be successful? And then finally, the fourth quadrant is create. What would we like to start doing that we're not doing today? So when we think about trade-offs, we really need to think about not how are we better, but what are we going to do differently? And what changes can we make by either eliminating, decreasing, increasing, or creating resource allocation? As Reed Hastings, CEO of Netflix, said, "If you're not genuinely pained by the risk involved in your strategic choices, then it's not much of a strategy."
I appreciate your strategic mind.
Must have a strategic brain.
Great strategic minds of tomorrow, right here.
In this segment, The League of Strategic Minds, I answer questions submitted by listeners. Today's question: what are the primary steps in strategy development? Typically, I consider 5 steps when you're developing strategy. The first is discovery. This is when we determine what competitive intelligence, customer intelligence, market intelligence, and then we do some thinking about the company as well, and we pull all of that together. I typically use an online strategy survey to bring all that information together. The second phase is strategic thinking. This is often missed by organizations who go right to the plan. But really, the plan is only valuable if it's infused with new thinking. And this is a stage where we get people together and typically use 4 to 8 different strategic thinking frameworks based on the company, based on the business, based on where you are. And we think strategically about the market, about customers, about the competition, about our value proposition, our value chain, our business model, all the things that might be relevant. And then we generate a list of ideas or insights on how we're going to profitably grow the business. The third step then is strategic planning. This is a step where we channel all of the insights from strategic thinking into an action plan, and I typically recommend 1 to 2 pages to make sure it's actionable. The fourth step is the strategy rollout. This is very important that we take the time to thoughtfully communicate strategy to all the folks in the organization, and we need to translate the strategy to tell them, what does this mean to you day in and day out in your job and in your role. And finally, the fifth step is the strategy tune-up. This is where we get together on a monthly or quarterly basis, typically 2 to 4 hours, and we talk through what's changing and how is that impacting our strategy. If you have a question that you'd like to hear answered, please go to the Strategic Minds podcast page, and you can find that link in the show notes. And there's an area there where you can submit your question. And if we read your question on the podcast, you'll receive some Strategic Minds swag for your contribution.
Any insights?
You play to win the game.
Any further insights?
You don't play to just play it.
Insightful.
I want winners.
I played the game to win.
I want people that want to win.
It's very insightful.
Our Winsight for today, our idea for advantage, comes from Richard Branson, the billionaire founder of the Virgin Group. He said, "The number one thing I take with me is a notebook. I could never have built the Virgin Company into the size it is without those few bits of paper. If you have a thought but don't write it down, by tomorrow morning, it may be gone forever." The question we'll leave you with today: where do you and your team currently record your insights, and how often do you review them? To explore engaging with me to facilitate your strategy workshop, serve as a coach for your executive team, or speak at your conference, visit strategyskills.com, where you can view today's show notes, sign up for the free Strategic Thinker newsletter, and access hundreds of other resources, including the Strategic Quotient, or SQ, assessment. Pick up a copy of my newly released book, Strategic, and take your leadership development to the next level by subscribing to the Strategic Fitness System, an innovative, state-of-the-art executive development platform. Remember, in today's competitive world, it's be strategic or be gone.